Good evening and welcome in. Settle yourself comfortably and let the day soften around you for a while. Tonight we are moving slowly through the world of Odysseus, the wandering Greek hero whose name is tied to clever plans, distant seas, patient endurance, and a long road home. His story has been carried through poetry, performance, and memory for many centuries, and even now it still feels full of salt air, dim harbors, and thoughts that arrive only after a long silence. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, you can like the video, subscribe gently for more calm history and mythology, and leave a soft comment if you'd like, perhaps saying where you're listening from tonight or which ancient story you might like next. But only if that feels easy. For now, there is nowhere else to be. The room can grow still. The world can become a little softer at the edges. And as we begin, let us drift into the first of many small facts about the man who travelled farther than most heroes ever did, and who often seemed to survive not by force alone, but by patience, wit, and the ability to keep going when the sea remained wide and the night remained long. Odysseus is best known as the king of Ithaca, a small island kingdom in the Ionian Sea. In the ancient imagination, Ithaca was not a grand empire or a shining capital. It was a place of slopes, coves, olive trees, and narrow shorelines, the kind of landscape that feels close to the sea and close to the weather. It was a ruler's home, but not the sort of home built to impress a crowd. That matters because Odysseus himself is a ruler whose authority rests as much on intelligence as on rank. He is not simply the strongest warrior in the room. He is the one who notices details, remembers routes, waits for the right moment, and chooses carefully. The island becomes part of his identity in the oldest stories, almost like a quiet signature. Ithaca is not just where he lives. It is the place that gives shape to his longing, his endurance, and his return. His name, in the Greek tradition, is closely linked with the idea of being angered or resented, though the exact etymology remains debated. Ancient names often carried a cloud of possible meanings rather than one fixed definition, and Odysseus belongs to that older, mistier world of language. His name has been traced by scholars to several roots and old forms, but no explanation is so certain that it closes the question completely. That uncertainty suits him. Even the sound of the name feels active and unsettled, as if it belongs to someone always in motion, always under pressure, always moving through trouble rather than resting inside it. In later storytelling, a name like his becomes almost inseparable from difficult endurance, from the feeling of having to keep going even when the path grows long and strange. One of the most important things to remember about Odysseus is that he is both a man of war and a man of homecoming. He is not only a battlefield figure, raised among shields, spears, and proud assemblies. He is also a husband, a father, a ruler, and a traveller who longs for his own hearth. That combination gives his story a softer sadness than many heroic tales. We are not just following an adventurer who loves danger. We are following someone who keeps looking back toward a place of peace. In the Homeric world, this makes him especially human. Glory matters, but so does the memory of bedchambers, storerooms, olive groves, and the ordinary life waiting behind closed doors. Odysseus carries both worlds inside him at once. Odysseus first appears in Greek tradition as a mortal hero, not a god, and that keeps his story grounded in a way many myths are not. He is not born from a cosmic explosion or raised above ordinary limits by divine essence. He is a man placed in a difficult world, and the myths around him often emphasize cleverness, speech, disguise, and survival under pressure. In that sense, he belongs to a special kind of heroism. He is less like a thunderstorm and more like a lantern carried through the dark. He does not erase darkness, but he helps people move through it. That makes him enduringly memorable, because his strengths resemble the kinds of skills people actually need: patience, memory, quick thinking, and the ability to read a room before speaking. Ancient audiences knew him chiefly through Homer's epics, especially the Odyssey, but his story also circles around the Iliad, where he appears as a capable and steady Greek leader during the war at Troy. The man who wanders home is already present in the man who stands among other commanders. He is observant, persuasive, and measured, and those qualities become just as important as bravery. In the Iliad, he is not the loudest hero, nor the most physically overwhelming, but he is often useful in the ways that keep a coalition together. He can speak in council, calm tempers, carry messages, and think through complications. Even in a poem full of battle noise and divine intervention, Odysseus stands out for his practical mind. Odysseus was also remembered for his voice. In Greek myth, speech can be a weapon, a shield, a disguise, or a bridge. Odysseus often uses words to survive what direct strength cannot solve. He listens to others, shapes arguments, and moves through danger with a kind of careful intelligence that feels deeply human. He knows when to speak plainly and when to conceal the truth. He knows how to flatter, how to question, and how to test another person's intentions. That may be why he still lingers in memory after so many centuries. He is not an impossible figure of perfection. He is a hero who has to think his way through the world, one uncertain day at a time. For sleep-time storytelling, there is something especially soothing in that image, a mind working calmly under pressure, choosing each step with care. The most famous setting connected to Odysseus is the long voyage after Troy, but his legend begins earlier in the older cycle of Greek heroic storytelling. He belongs to the generation shaped by the Trojan War, a world where oaths, alliances, pride, and divine attention all matter. In those stories, human decisions are never truly isolated. A vow can reshape a kingdom. A judgment can awaken the anger of a god. A single insult can echo for years. Odysseus moves through that atmosphere with caution and intelligence, like someone aware that every action may have consequences far beyond the present moment. From the beginning, he is not alone in a simple sense. He is part of a larger fabric of myth, woven among kings, warriors, and gods who seem to keep one eye on human affairs. What makes him endure, however, is not just his place in that web. It is the feeling that his story understands something timeless about being far from home. That feeling runs through the Odyssey with unusual emotional patience. Odysseus is not merely lost. He is separated, delayed, tested, concealed, and repeatedly reminded of what he left behind. The distance between him and Ithaca becomes almost physical in the mind of the audience. It is a distance made of water, but also of time, memory, and fatigue. That is why his name still carries so much weight. It speaks of distance, patience, memory, and the long, quiet ache of return. In the ancient poems, Odysseus is often introduced through the things others say about him. He is the sort of figure whose reputation arrives before he does. Some admire his wisdom, some distrust his methods, some fear that his cleverness is too sharp, too flexible, too willing to bend a situation in his favor. That tension gives him depth. Greek heroic culture often praised both strength and intelligence, but it did not always know how to separate noble cleverness from dangerous trickery. Odysseus lives right in that borderland. He can be deeply admirable and slightly unsettling at the same time, which may be one reason his personality feels so alive. His home island also helps define him because it is modest compared with the great centers of power in myth. Ithaca is not Mycenae, not Pylos, not Sparta, not Troy. It is smaller, quieter, and more remote. In some traditions, this modesty makes Odysseus seem even more resourceful. He is a ruler from a place that must rely on judgment rather than size. A small island requires attentiveness. It requires knowing the people, the roads, the shoreline, the resources, and the rhythm of seasons. Odysseus seems shaped by that environment. He is not a king who can afford to be careless. He is a king whose mind has to be awake. The mortals surrounding him often live in a world where reputation matters almost as much as action. A hero can be remembered for what he does, but also for how he speaks, how he endures, and how he handles uncertainty. Odysseus is especially suited to that kind of culture because he is never merely a body in motion. He is a consciousness at work. He observes the signs around him. He weighs possibilities. He waits when waiting is wiser than charging forward. In oral epic, these qualities could be shown through repeated formulas and careful scenes, allowing listeners to feel the rhythm of thought as much as the rhythm of combat. Odysseus becomes one of the most recognizable figures in that tradition because he makes intelligence visible. There is also something quietly domestic about him, even in the middle of epic conflict. The poems repeatedly remind us that he belongs to a household, a family line, and a kingly seat that need tending. Ancient audiences would have understood the importance of this. A home was not a private luxury. It was a social center, a place of inheritance, meals, ritual, storage, and continuity. To be absent from home for years was not only emotional suffering. It was a disruption in the structure of life. Odysseus therefore becomes a symbol of interrupted order, of the long effort to restore a broken household and re-establish a rightful place in the world. Scholarly traditions about Odysseus have always tried to separate older myth from later interpretation, but he resists easy simplification. He is at once legendary and literary, a character shaped by older oral tales and then given lasting form through Homer. That means there is no single historical Odysseus we can recover, only a layered figure built from memory, poetry, and cultural imagination. Some parts of his character may reflect older story types, including the clever king, the returning warrior, the deceptive survivor, and the man tested by the gods. Over time, these patterns gathered around his name until he became larger than any one source. The texture of his story also matters. It is full of seafaring, island stops, strange encounters, and the slow fatigue of long travel. The sea in Greek epic is never just scenery. It is a living force, sometimes calm, sometimes punishing, always indifferent to human wishes. Odysseus becomes memorable partly because he keeps moving through that uncertain element. He is not carried easily from place to place. He is delayed, thrown off course, and tested by environments that seem to resist human planning. And yet he endures. That endurance gives his story a gentle gravity, the feeling of a person staying awake through the dark, trusting that the morning will eventually arrive. At the same time, Odysseus is deeply tied to memory. He remembers names, instructions, warnings, and promises. He remembers the path home, but he also remembers the shape of loss. In epic storytelling, memory is a kind of strength. To remember is to preserve identity when time and distance try to dissolve it. Odysseus carries that burden quietly. He remains Odysseus even when he is disguised, displaced, or unrecognized. The self persists through change, and that is one of the most moving parts of his myth. He does not simply survive physically. He preserves the inward thread that connects him to Ithaca, to Penelope, to Telemachus, and to the life waiting for him beyond the sea. This is why his figure still feels familiar, even to listeners far removed from the ancient world. Odysseus is a hero of navigation, but also a hero of attention. He notices what others overlook. He waits when impatience would be costly. He adapts without disappearing. He is resourceful without becoming entirely untouchable. In a sense, he embodies the human hope that intelligence can help us endure what strength alone cannot solve. That idea has a calming quality in itself. It suggests that survival is not always loud. Sometimes it is careful. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is simply the decision to keep going until the way home becomes visible again. Odysseus was said to be the son of Laertes, a king associated with Ithaca, and of Anticlea, who belonged to a noble family connected with the wider heroic world. This parentage places him in a familiar mythic pattern, where a hero's identity is never just personal, but woven from household, region, and reputation. In the ancient imagination, a great man rarely arrives alone. He is carried by names that came before him, by old agreements, by marriage links, and by the quiet pressure of inheritance. Odysseus belongs to that kind of story from the beginning. His family ties matter because they connect him not only to a home island, but to older networks of wealth, expectation, and remembered status. Even before he becomes famous, He is already situated in a world where ancestry itself has meaning. Some traditions, however, mention a different possibility. A few ancient sources hint that Sisyphus, the famously cunning trickster, may have been involved in Odysseus's lineage. This is not the dominant version, and it should be treated carefully, but it is a revealing one. Myth often preserves such alternate threads, not because they are always equally trusted, but because they show what ancient listeners felt to be possible. The rumor is interesting precisely because it fits so well. Sisyphus was a figure associated with intelligence, calculation, and the kind of wit that can bend circumstances without fully breaking them. Odysseus is often described in very similar terms. Even when the genealogy is uncertain, the resemblance feels meaningful, as though character and ancestry are being made to echo one another. In that way, the stories say something about how the Greeks understood heroic nature. A mind like Odysseus's must have come from somewhere older and stranger. His upbringing on Ithaca would likely have been that of a royal child in a small island kingdom. Such a life would not have meant marble palaces in the later sense, but it would have involved authority, servants' obligations, and the education expected of a future ruler. The house would have been busy in the modest, practical way of an elite Bronze Age or early epic setting. Food prepared, storerooms watched, guests received, animals counted, and claims to leadership quietly maintained. A prince in the Homeric world needed to know how to speak in assembly, how to judge disputes, how to honor guests, and how to appear worthy before allies. These were not abstract skills, they were daily habits of rank. Odysseus grows into a man who can do all of those things, and the poem later shows how much this background matters, because leadership in Homer is as much performance as it is power. One story about his youth involves the hunting of a boar on Mount Parnassus, where he was injured and marked by a scar. This episode belongs to a treasured kind of heroic memory, the kind that later audiences can easily picture in the cool air of the mountains. A hunt would have been more than sport. It was an occasion for danger, discipline, and social bonding among young men and their elders. The boar itself is a classic symbol of wild force, heavy and aggressive, difficult to control. To meet such an animal was to enter a test of nerve. Odysseus's wound in that encounter becomes one of the most famous identifying details in the Odyssey. It gives him a physical memory of youth carried into old age, and it becomes a quiet emblem of continuity. Heroes in myth are often recognized by glorious armor or shining faces, but Odysseus is also recognized by a wound. The detail is intimate, almost domestic, and it reminds us that his body bears the record of his life. The boar hunt itself belongs to a world of aristocratic training, where young men proved courage through danger under the guidance of older companions. Such scenes appear in Greek literature as rites of passage, moments when youth is tested by the wildness of nature and by the demands of reputation. In a society that valued visible competence, a wound earned in the right way could become a badge of honor. For Odysseus, the scar is more than decoration. It is a sign that he has already survived something intense before the main story even begins. That matters because the Odyssey is full of recognition scenes, and this one is among the most memorable. The great wanderer is not simply identified by speech or status, but by a mark formed in the remote past when he was still young and uncertain. His name within the family line of Ithaca also suggests succession. He is not a wandering outsider who suddenly appears from nowhere. He is a rightful heir, one whose absence will matter deeply later. That idea of rightful continuity is easy to overlook when the poem turns toward travel and disguise, but it remains one of the foundations of the story. The return of Odysseus is meaningful precisely because he belongs to the island, to the house, to the line, and to the memory of those who knew him before war carried him away. In epic terms, home is not just a place to come back to. It is also a claim that must be defended, remembered, and recognized. The house of Laertes is part of Odysseus in the way a harbor is part of a ship's meaning. At the same time, Homeric kingship was never simple or secure. A ruler's authority depended on gifts, alliances, household order, and public respect. The king did not rule by distance alone. He had to remain visible, persuasive, and embedded in a network of obligations. If that network faltered, authority could loosen quickly. Odysseus's future problems in Ithaca will grow out of that fragile structure. His family background gives him legitimacy, but it also leaves him vulnerable if he vanishes for too long. The longer the absence, the more room there is for disorder, rumor, and rival claims. That tension between belonging and absence is one of the soft, quiet engines of his myth. It helps explain why his return feels not only dramatic, but necessary, almost restorative, as though a pattern broken in one generation must eventually be made whole again. So even before the famous voyage begins, Odysseus is already defined by two kinds of inheritance. He inherits a place and he inherits a mind. The island gives him a home, the family line gives him a name, and the stories that follow will show what happens when both must be defended across years of distance and uncertainty. In that sense, the early life of Odysseus is not a separate prologue, but part of the poem's deeper structure. The man who will later become the master of postponement, disguise, and survival is already being shaped by the conditions of succession, recognition, and memory. Odysseus is also one of the rare heroic figures whose identity feels both stable and slippery at once. His place in the royal household is clear, yet his mind seems to move in unexpected directions. Ancient audiences may have found that combination especially compelling. A king was expected to be rooted, but he was also expected to adapt. Odysseus becomes a model for that balance. Even his origins suggest that he is a man formed at the intersection of firmness and flexibility. The household gives him form, the rumors of clever ancestry give him motion, and together they produce a hero who can belong to a place without becoming trapped by it. It is worth remembering, too, that the heroic world was transmitted through poetry long before it was fixed in prose summary. Details like parentage, scars, and childhood hunts were not simply facts in a modern sense. They were pieces of a living tradition, repeated because they helped listeners feel the texture of a life. A scar may seem minor, but in epic it can carry memory more effectively than a speech. Likewise, a lineage can do more than establish family relations. It can signal the moral atmosphere of an entire story. The ancient poets understood this well. They gave Odysseus a background that could support both grandeur and ambiguity. The possibility of a Sisyphus connection is especially suggestive because it highlights the ancient fascination with inherited intelligence. Some heroes are remembered for force, others for beauty, others for piety. Odysseus is remembered for practical wit, for the ability to see an opening and act within it. If that quality is reflected back into his family line, then the myth is almost saying that cleverness is hereditary, or at least familial, in the same way that land and authority are inherited. Of course, the Greeks also knew that a story can be altered by the storyteller's purpose. A genealogy might be adjusted to emphasize character, to explain reputation, or simply to make a tale more resonant. The uncertainty itself is part of the ancient landscape. His youth on Ithaca would also have been shaped by the rhythms of island life. Ithaca is not imagined as a vast kingdom, but as a small, rugged place with strong local memory. That setting matters. On a smaller island, people know one another. Names carry weight. A household's behavior is visible to its neighbors. A young prince grows up under that kind of attention, learning that dignity is not only inherited but maintained through conduct. The sea surrounds the island, but it does not erase its order. If anything, the sea sharpens the value of order, because travel, trade, and contact with the wider world all depend on the stability of the home they leave behind. Odysseus comes from exactly such a place, modest in scale, but rich in symbolic importance. The boar scar in that context becomes even more memorable. It is a sign that the future king once stepped beyond the safety of the household into the uneven terrain of the mountain. It suggests a movement from enclosure to risk, from expectation to trial. That transition is one of the oldest patterns in myth. A young person leaves the known space, encounters the wild, and returns altered. In Odysseus's case, the mark from that encounter remains on his body for the rest of his life. The body remembers what the house cannot fully contain. And later, when disguise and concealment become central to his story, the scar serves as a counterweight. Even when he hides his identity, the past is still there, quietly waiting to be seen. The language of succession also helps explain why Odysseus's absence becomes so important in the later story. A king who leaves may not simply be missed, he may leave a vacuum. In the world of Homer, such a vacuum attracts disorder almost naturally. Suitors gather, resources are consumed, the household becomes contested space. This makes Odysseus's return feel less like a personal success and more like the restoration of a disrupted pattern. His identity as son, husband, father, and ruler is all bound together. Remove one strand for too long and the others begin to fray. The myth understands this carefully, and it gives the poem its quiet tension long before the final homecoming. In that sense, Odysseus's early life already contains the whole shape of his legend. He is born into a line that gives him standing, yet he carries a reputation for intelligence that seems to exceed simple inheritance. He is marked by a scar that links youth and maturity. He is formed in a small kingdom where leadership depends on memory and performance, and he is surrounded by traditions that are not always consistent, but always revealing. The ancient sources do not always agree on every detail, and that lack of certainty is part of what makes the figure feel alive. Odysseus emerges not as a perfectly sealed biography, but as a hero assembled from ancestry, rumor, experience, and the patient work of storytelling. Odysseus is one of the clearest examples in Greek myth of a hero whose intelligence is treated as a serious form of strength. In the heroic world of ancient Greece, that mattered more than modern readers sometimes expect. A man could be admired for the force of his spear arm, for the shock of his courage in battle, or for the beauty of his lineage, but he could also be praised for being alert, careful, and adaptable. Odysseus belongs to that second kind of greatness. The Greeks had a deep respect for cunning, flexibility, and strategic thought, especially in situations where direct force might fail. Their stories often show that a warrior who only knows how to strike is not always the one who lives to the end. Odysseus is often described with words connected to craftiness and resourcefulness, and those qualities are not meant to diminish him. They are part of his greatness. In a culture that admired courage, it was still understood that the battlefield, the council, and the sea all demanded different kinds of excellence. A hero who could move between those worlds was especially valuable. His mind is especially important in the stories about Troy. Odysseus is not the loudest hero, nor always the most physically imposing, but he is one of the most consequential. In many traditions, he is the man who knows how to persuade difficult companions, read danger quickly, and turn a situation toward advantage. This is not trickery for its own sake. It is adaptation, a calm intelligence under pressure. In the ancient world, survival often depended on such qualities, whether on campaign, in politics, or in a palace where one wrong choice could change everything. A king's hall could be as dangerous as a battlefield, and a night crossing at sea could require more judgment than strength. Odysseus seems to understand that. He listens, weighs, waits, and then acts with precision. That makes him feel less like a simple warrior and more like a person who has learned how fragile human plans can be. That intelligence has a moral ambiguity attached to it. Odysseus is admired, but he is also sometimes distrusted. Myth does not present him as pure simplicity. He can be cautious, secretive, and at times self-protective in ways that make him feel less transparent than other heroes. Yet that complexity is exactly what keeps him interesting. He seems to understand that life is full of layered situations, and that direct action is not always the wisest route. Ancient stories often enjoy this tension. They do not always separate cleverness into neat categories of good and bad. A plan can save a life and still raise doubts. A disguise can protect a home and also hide a wound in the soul. Odysseus lives in that uncertain space, where intelligence can look noble from one angle and unsettling from another. The ancient Greek term often linked to him, polytropos, means something like of many turns or many-minded. It is one of the most famous descriptions in all of literature because it captures how versatile he is. Odysseus is changeable in the best sense. He can become different things as circumstances demand. A beggar, a strategist, a speaker, a sailor, a father, a husband, a warrior, a survivor. The shape of his story depends on that ability to adjust. The word itself suggests movement, bending, and winding paths. It is not the language of a straight road. It is the language of someone who knows how to follow curves, to notice openings, and to remain alive when the route ahead is obscured by fog or grief. That image fits the Odyssey especially well, because so much of the poem is about finding a way through worlds that do not stay still. This many-sided quality also makes him a literary figure of exceptional depth. He is not trapped in one heroic mode. He can endure quiet moments as well as violent ones. He can think in circles, hold back information, and allow time to do part of the work. That is one reason the Odyssey feels less like a simple victory tale and more like a study in patience. The poem often invites us to notice pauses, delays, and repetitions. Odysseus does not simply arrive. He must wait, observe, conceal, and try again. The silence before action matters. The careful choice of words matters. Even the hesitation to reveal one's identity can become part of the drama. In this way, the hero's mind is not shown as a flash of genius alone, but as a disciplined habit of attention. A hero like Achilles often stands for speed, brilliance, and the flash of martial glory. Odysseus stands for delay, planning, concealment, and return. He is not less heroic for being slower. If anything, his strength lies in the fact that he can keep his purpose intact across many years, even when the world around him seems designed to scatter it. That is a different kind of greatness, and perhaps a quieter one. It asks for stamina rather than instant triumph. It asks for memory. It asks for the ability to hold one image of home in the mind while everything else shifts and erodes. In the ancient imagination, that kind of inward steadiness could be as demanding as any battle. Greek audiences would have recognized the value of that trait. Their lives, like ours, were shaped by uncertainty. Ships did not always arrive. Wars did not end cleanly. Households could be broken. Roads could be dangerous. In that setting, a man who could think through chaos had an almost sacred usefulness. A storm at sea, a dispute in council, a hostile stranger at the door, a sudden test of hospitality, all could call for judgment before strength. The epic world is full of such thresholds. Odysseus moves through them with a mixture of caution and nerve. He is not always right, and the stories never make him fully beyond error, but he is often ready for the fact that reality will ask more of him than one fixed talent. Odysseus therefore becomes not only a character but a pattern. He suggests that intelligence can be patient, that wit can be honorable, and that endurance sometimes looks quiet from the outside. His myth keeps returning to that truth in different forms, as if the story itself wants to linger over the idea that a clever mind can be as worthy of admiration as a strong arm. In many later readings, he becomes a figure for the human capacity to adapt without entirely losing oneself. That tension is gentle but powerful. How much should one bend? How much can one conceal? How long can one wait before waiting becomes another kind of burden? The poem does not solve these questions neatly. It simply keeps showing a man who lives inside them. And so, before we even reach the sea, we already know something important about him. Odysseus is a hero who survives by seeing more than one path. That sense of multiple paths also helps explain why Odysseus feels so modern to many readers. Even though his story belongs to a world of bronze weapons, palace halls, and divine intervention. He is not built from a single heroic pose. He is mobile in thought. He can shift between roles with a speed that feels almost psychological. One moment he is a leader speaking in formal assembly, the next he is a man listening carefully from the edge of danger, and later he may be a disguised beggar studying the behavior of those around him. Such movement is not random. It is part of a larger intelligence that recognizes when visibility is useful and when invisibility is safer. Ancient storytelling often admired this ability because it mirrored the practical demands of life in a divided, unstable world. There is also something distinctly human in the way Odysseus uses his mind. His cleverness is never abstract. It is tied to hunger, fear, loyalty, homecoming, and loss. He thinks not because thinking is elegant, but because thinking is necessary. In that sense, he is close to the texture of ordinary survival. He is a royal hero, yes, but the poem keeps bringing him back to simple physical needs: shelter from weather, food after deprivation, a place to rest, a name that still means something. Intelligence in the Odyssey is not a luxury. It is a way of moving through difficulty without being consumed by it. That grounding makes his character feel sturdy, even when the story becomes strange or magical. The ambiguity around him may also come from the Greek awareness that cleverness can unsettle social order. A warrior's strength is visible, but a clever person might hide their intentions. That can be useful in war and troubling in the home. Odysseus often occupies that uneasy space. He can tell the right story, but he can also withhold the full truth. He can negotiate, but he can also deceive. For listeners in the ancient world, this would not necessarily have made him unworthy. Rather, it would have made him realistic. Human communities depend on trust, but they also depend on judgment, and judgment sometimes requires secrecy. Odysseus embodies that truth in a vivid and memorable way. His very name has become attached to the idea of endurance through intelligence, not just planning but replanning, not just courage but staying power. A lesser hero might blaze brightly and disappear. Odysseus remains. He continues, even when the continuation is slow, uneven, and marked by loss. That persistence gives the later parts of his story their emotional weight. We are not only watching a man solve problems, we are watching a person continue to exist in the face of disruption. He has to carry memory across years that do not cooperate. He has to keep a private center while the world around him becomes unstable. This is one of the reasons the epic can feel so restful in tone, even while describing hardship. It trusts the patient motion of a mind that keeps returning to purpose. The Greek tradition did not imagine wisdom as distant from the body. Odysseus' intelligence is often shown through gesture, timing, and practical action. He knows when to stay still, when to speak, when to disguise himself, and when to step forward. He is a thinker, but not a detached one. He is embedded in weather, in ships, in rooms, in conversations, in the changing faces of strangers. His cleverness belongs to lived experience. That gives the myth a grounded texture. Even the most extraordinary episodes are supported by the ordinary labor of watching and deciding. In that sense, Odysseus's mind feels almost tactile, like hands working a difficult knot or guiding a boat through shifting water. There is a quiet dignity in that portrayal. The poem never reduces him to mere trickster energy. It keeps him connected to responsibility. He is not just escaping danger for his own amusement. He is trying to return. He is trying to restore a life. He is trying to become again the person whom his household remembers, even after long absence. That effort gives his intelligence a moral shape. It is not brilliance for prestige. It is brilliance in service of home, order, and survival. And that may be why the figure continues to resonate. Many stories celebrate the moment of victory. Odysseus is loved because he shows what happens after victory is delayed, scattered, and made uncertain. If Achilles represents the burning edge of heroic life, Odysseus represents the long middle. The part where one keeps going, the part where a person must endure inconvenience, grief, and delay without losing the thread. That is not a lesser epic mode. It is simply a different one, and in some ways a more familiar one. Most lives are not shaped by one brilliant leap. They are shaped by many smaller acts of adjustment. Odysseus, with all his turns and disguises, seems to know that. He becomes a figure for the patient intelligence needed when certainty has disappeared. And that is why his stories remain so compelling. They do not ask us to admire him only because he wins. They ask us to notice how he thinks, how he waits, and how he carries himself through uncertainty. In the cool language of epic and in the shadowed rooms of memory, Odysseus keeps demonstrating the same lesson, that a human being can survive by seeing around corners, by holding several possibilities at once, and by remaining steady enough to choose the one that leads home. In the ancient epic tradition, Odysseus plays an important role in the war at Troy, where many of the Greek heroes gather under a shared cause. His part in that conflict is often marked by diplomacy, strategy, and careful speech. He is not simply a fighter on the front line, though he can certainly fight when needed. More often, the stories place him near the place where plans are made, where quarrels are settled, or where a choice must be spoken aloud before it becomes action. In that sense, he belongs to the quieter architecture of war, the human framework that sits behind the clang of bronze. The world of the epics is full of movement, but it also depends on pauses, on moments when someone must think ahead, weigh a risk, or guide a crowd away from disorder. Odysseus is often that kind of man. This balance between force and language is one of the most enduring aspects of his character. In the Iliad, he appears among the Greek leaders as a steady and versatile figure. He is capable in battle, but he is also valuable in counsel. That dual role reflects an older heroic ideal, one in which a leader must be able to hold a spear and a sentence with equal seriousness. The Homeric world does not treat these as separate realms. Both are forms of authority. A well-timed speech can steady a line of soldiers just as surely as a shield wall can. A good decision, once accepted by others, can shape the outcome of a day in the field. Odysseus belongs to this more layered kind of heroism, where intellect does not weaken strength but completes it. Even in descriptions of camp life, he often seems to bring a certain order with him, a sense that someone has remembered the larger shape of things. Odysseus is also known for his involvement in sending or receiving messages, which gives him a diplomatic dimension that many other heroes lack. He can move between competing interests, represent a cause, and speak in ways that make people listen. These abilities are quietly powerful in a poem otherwise crowded with duels and divine interventions. They remind us that war is not only won through violence, it is also managed through timing, persuasion, and judgment. A messenger in epic is not merely a courier. He is a bearer of trust, a person who must carry meaning intact through spaces of tension and pride. Odysseus is often suited to such tasks because he understands the weight of words. He knows when to soften a message and when to make it plain. In a story world where tempers rise quickly and honor can become a dangerous kind of flame, this is a rare and useful talent. Some traditions place him at the center of efforts to reconcile disputes among the Greeks themselves. That is a useful reminder that heroic tales often include friction within the heroic camp. The men who sail together are not always united in temperament. In such an environment, Odysseus's calmness becomes a stabilizing force. He understands how to hold a group together when pride threatens to scatter it. The Greek force before Troy is sometimes imagined as a grand coalition, but coalitions are delicate things. They depend on shared purpose, yet they are also shaped by rivalry, impatience, and different senses of rank. Odysseus often stands in the space where those differences must be managed. He is the sort of figure who can speak to a king without forgetting the soldiers, or speak to the soldiers without losing the attention of kings. That ability does not always make him loved, but it often makes him effective. His link to Troy also connects him with one of the most famous objects in myth, the wooden horse. later tradition gives Odysseus a central role in that stratagem, which is fitting because the plan depends on concealment, patience, and an ability to imagine what others will not. The Trojan horse story has become one of the best-known examples of tactical intelligence in world literature. Even when told briefly, it carries the unmistakable stamp of Odysseus's style. It is a story about appearances and expectations, about what happens when an enemy looks at a thing and sees only what he is prepared to see. The horse itself is almost theatrical in its simplicity, a visible object that hides an invisible purpose. That is part of why the tale has endured so long in memory. It feels like a story about the limits of certainty. In many later retellings, Odysseus seems almost to embody the mind that can live inside such uncertainty without panic, turning it into a plan instead of a problem. It is worth noting that mythic war stories often change depending on the source. Different poets, local traditions, and later writers all emphasize different features. Yet the consistent image of Odysseus in the Trojan cycle is that of a man who can think inside complexity. He does not merely react to events, he works around them. That phrase may sound simple, but in myth it carries real force. Heroes are often defined by direct confrontation, by the moment of clash or refusal. Odysseus is defined just as much by detour, by adjustment, by the side path that leads to the needed result. Some traditions make him more generous, others more severe, and still others more cunning in a morally uneasy way. But across those versions, he remains someone who is comfortable with difficulty. He can tolerate delay, and he can survive ambiguity. In epic storytelling, that is a remarkable quality, because the world itself is usually split between clear loyalties and clear dangers. Odysseus moves through that world as if he can see the seams. This makes him feel especially modern, even though his story is ancient. Many people recognize in him the kind of person who does not dominate every room but who knows how to read it. In a military setting, that may be the difference between chaos and order. In a narrative setting, it gives the story a softer kind of tension, one based on observation rather than spectacle alone. Odysseus is rarely just present, he is attentive. He notices who is speaking too loudly, who is hesitating, who is hiding offense behind formality. He seems to understand that large events are often shaped by small moments of interpretation. A glance, a pause, a phrasing of words, a refusal to rush, these can matter in ways that are not immediately obvious. That is part of his quiet fascination. He does not need to be the loudest figure in the scene to become one of the most consequential. And so the years of Troy become one of the great shaping forces in his life. They provide his heroism with context, but they also deepen the sadness of everything that follows. For once a man has seen that much war, the return home can never be simple again. The siege is not merely a background event in his biography. It is the long pressure that alters him before the voyage even begins. The dust of the camp, the waiting, the losses, the shifting loyalties, the long habitual strain of being away from home, all of this accumulates in the mythic memory around him. When later stories show Odysseus longing for Ithaca, they are not simply describing homesickness. They are describing someone who has lived through a collective ordeal and must now carry the inner consequences alone. War changes time. It makes years feel heavy. It teaches patience in ways that are hard to unlearn. That broader war context also helps explain why Odysseus is so often associated with endurance rather than sudden glory. Some heroes burn brightly in a single moment. Odysseus is different. He belongs to the long game. At Troy and in the stories around Troy, he is a figure of persistence, a man who can remain useful over extended hardship. That quality matters in an epic cycle that stretches across seasons and across many acts of patience. There is an almost documentary feeling in the way later tradition remembers him here, not as a mythical ornament, but as a working intelligence within a difficult campaign. He is the one who can be sent, consulted, or trusted when circumstances grow tangled. That trust is itself part of his reputation, and reputation in epic is often as important as physical strength. The Iliad and related stories also present Odysseus as a member of a wider heroic community, which means his individuality is always measured against other famous names. He is among great warriors, but he stands apart in style. Where some heroes are defined by forcefulness, he is often defined by usefulness. Where some are tied to wrath, he is tied to function. This does not make him less heroic. In many ways, it makes him more adaptable, which is its own kind of excellence. The ancient audience would have understood that a war effort depends on different talents. Someone must strike, someone must guard, someone must negotiate, someone must persuade. Odysseus seems to be the man who can step into several of those roles without losing himself. That versatility gives him a special place in the tradition, one that later ages would continue to revisit with fascination. There is also a subtle human quality in the way his Trojan reputation is shaped. He is not presented as a perfect emblem. He is practical, and that practicality can sometimes look like suspicion or secrecy from the outside. Yet within the pressures of the epic world, those traits are not weaknesses. They are tools of survival. The poems seem to suggest that not every victory comes from open force, and not every worthy act is visible at first glance. Odysseus belongs to that quieter moral space where discretion has value. Even when the stories are uncertain or contradictory, they repeatedly return to the sense that he is the one who can navigate a situation that would trap a less thoughtful man. This is perhaps why his role in the Trojan tradition feels so lasting. Troy is the place where the Great War is seen in its full complexity. Alliances, honor, grief, pride, endurance, and deception all gathered in one long historical mythic field. Odysseus moves through that field like someone who understands that every victory leaves a residue. The end of the war does not erase the years of strain. It simply opens the next difficult chapter. In that way, the Troy cycle becomes more than a background to later adventures. It is the emotional and strategic education of Odysseus himself. The man who will later be known for wandering is first shaped by a siege, by the strange stillness of a war that lasts too long, and by the knowledge that sometimes the hardest work is not fighting, but waiting until the moment is right. Even in a broad retelling, this part of his story invites a slower mood. There is something steady about him here, something composed under pressure. He stands near the center of a famous conflict without becoming a simple symbol of it. He is a leader but also a listener, a fighter but also a planner, a participant in the glory of war but also one of the people who understands its cost. That combination is one reason Odysseus remains so memorable in the ancient tradition. He does not just belong to the age of heroes. He belongs to the more difficult wisdom that follows heroism, when the loudness fades and the consequences remain. The Trojan horse is one of the most famous stories associated with Odysseus, though scholars have long noted that its historicity cannot be confirmed in the way a modern history might confirm a battle or treaty. There is no surviving eyewitness record to verify every detail, and the story belongs to the world where memory, poetry, and cultural meaning overlap. For that reason, what matters most in myth is often not literal proof, but the idea the tale preserves. In this case, the idea is that intelligence can succeed where strength alone reaches its limit. A hidden design, a patient plan, and the willingness to remain silent until the right moment all become part of the victory. Odysseus is frequently named as the inventor or driving force behind the horse, and that attribution fits his character with unusual precision. The strategy depends on a rare form of imagination. It asks a commander to think not only about what he wants to do, but about how the enemy will interpret every visible sign. What would a city believe if its attackers seemed to have withdrawn? What objects would appear harmless after years of violence? What would make hope seem safer than suspicion? Odysseus is the hero most associated with these questions. He does not simply observe the world in front of him. He mentally enters the minds of others and follows their likely choices before they make them. The wooden horse itself has become more symbolic than physical in later retellings. In artistic memory, it stands for deception, ingenuity, and the thin border between triumph and trickery. It is easy to admire the success of the plan, and just as easy to feel unease about the method. Odysseus, more than almost any other Greek hero, inhabits that uneasy border. His intelligence is celebrated, but it is never entirely simple. Greek literature often allows his brilliance to carry a double weight. It can be heroic and unsettling at once. The same mind that saves lives can also blur the line between wisdom and manipulation. Some versions of the story present the horse as a communal project rather than the invention of one man alone. That detail is important because ancient myth often gathers collective action beneath a single famous name. A strategy may be attributed to Odysseus, while still reflecting the broader military culture of the Greeks, who valued cunning as a form of strength. In that sense, the horse is not only a sign of one hero's cleverness, it also expresses a shared admiration for strategic thinking, patient planning, and the disciplined use of delay. Even when one figure becomes the symbol, the story still carries the labor of many voices. The horse also speaks quietly to the theme of reversal, which appears again and again in Odyssean tradition. After years of open warfare, victory arrives through concealment. After a long siege, the solution comes not in a final charge, but in something still, hollow, and almost vulnerable in appearance. This reversal is part of what makes the story so enduring. It reminds listeners that the expected path is not always the decisive one. Odysseus repeatedly enters situations where outward weakness hides inward advantage, and where what seems obvious may in fact be the most dangerous illusion of all. That is one reason the Trojan horse has traveled so far beyond its ancient setting. The image is simple enough to remember, yet layered enough to keep unfolding in the mind. It is at once an object, a trick, a passage, and a symbol. A wooden shape standing outside a city gate becomes a lesson about trust, desire, and hidden intent. When people speak today of a Trojan horse, they are still drawing on that old mythic shape to describe a concealed threat. The phrase remains powerful because it captures a fear that is still familiar. That danger may arrive dressed as a gift. In the broader emotional arc of Odysseus's life, though, the horse marks something more than a military success. It is a threshold. It stands near the end of the Trojan War, just before his long return begins. The war is finally won, but home is not yet near. That interval matters deeply in myth. It is the moment when one struggle has ended, but peace has not yet truly begun. Odysseus stands there between endings, carrying the weight of triumph into a future that will test him in very different ways. The horse is therefore not only a conclusion, it is also a doorway, and perhaps that is why the story remains so memorable. It is not simply a tale of cleverness. It is the moment when cleverness itself becomes burdensome, because every victory can open onto a harder road. The mind that solves one impossible problem may be the same mind that must now endure a longer and lonelier journey. In Odysseus's world, success is never entirely settled. It arrives, and then it asks to be paid for with patience. Odysseus is also remembered as a figure whose intelligence works most effectively when it is hidden. The horse reflects that quality almost perfectly. Nothing about the object looks like a battlefield weapon at first glance. Its form suggests ceremony, offering, or display rather than attack. That outward calm is part of the strategy. Ancient warfare often involved displays meant to shape morale as much as to move bodies. A sign of withdrawal could be more powerful than a visible army. A strange object left behind in the dust could unsettle a city more deeply than another day of fighting. Odysseus understands this atmosphere of hesitation and uses it as carefully as any spear or shield. The story also depends on the psychology of exhaustion. After long suffering, people often want relief so strongly that relief itself can become persuasive. The Trojans in many versions are tired, hopeful, and eager to believe the war may finally be over. Myth does not present them as foolish in any simple sense. It presents them as human. They are caught between caution and desire, between memory of danger and longing for rest. Odysseus's plan works because it recognizes that tired minds are not blank minds. They are often minds most vulnerable to persuasive appearances. In that respect, the Trojan horse is less about brute cunning than about emotional timing. A brilliant plan is not only clever in design, it is also placed at the exact moment when the audience is ready to misread it. Odysseus is frequently associated with this kind of timing. He knows when to speak and when to stay quiet. He knows when a gesture will be noticed and when silence itself can do the work. The horse becomes a material version of that skill. It waits. It invites interpretation. It lets its meaning unfold only after the choice has been made. Later Greek and Roman writers were fascinated by this kind of intelligence. They often treated Odysseus as the hero of adaptability, not just a force. That is one reason he continues to feel modern. Many heroic figures in ancient myth are defined by direct confrontation, but Odysseus operates through comparison, disguise, and reading the room, so to speak. He thinks in terms of perception. He asks how things will appear from another point of view. The Trojan horse is perhaps the clearest expression of that habit. It turns victory into an exercise in how opponents see or fail to see what is standing before them. At the same time, the story preserves an old discomfort with deception. Greek culture admired intelligence, but it did not always trust it. A clever plan could be noble, but it could also be morally ambiguous. Odysseus often lives in that ambiguity. His brilliance helps save the Greek cause, yet his methods can seem shadowed, indirect, and difficult to praise without reservation. The horse magnifies that tension. It invites applause for the outcome, while quietly asking whether the means should also be admired. Myth rarely answers the question outright. Instead, it leaves the listener to feel both satisfaction and doubt. Because the horse is so visually distinct, it also gathered layers of interpretation over time. In vase painting, sculpture, later literature, and modern retellings, it often becomes a compact emblem of war's strange intelligence. It is a thing made from wood, a material that suggests craftsmanship and patience rather than violence, yet inside that calm surface lies danger. The contrast is part of the symbolism. Something that looks domestic or decorative can be transformed into a vehicle of destruction. That transformation gives the story its lasting force. It is not only about hiding soldiers. It is about the unsettling possibility that appearances can be engineered. For this reason, the Trojan horse has outlived the particular details of the war itself. Most people who use the phrase today are not thinking about Troy as an archaeological site or about the ancient texts in their original language. They are using a metaphor of hidden intent, something that entered common speech, because the myth captured it so cleanly. Odysseus's name remains attached to that metaphor because he embodies the intelligence behind it. Even when the historical record cannot be settled, the cultural memory remains vivid. The story survives because it keeps speaking to a recurring human fear that the door we open most willingly may be the one that brings trouble inside. The horse also marks a subtle change in the mood of the epic world. For so long, the conflict at Troy has been defined by visible force, open challenge, and the grinding certainty of siege. Then, suddenly, the decisive move comes through stillness. It is quiet enough to seem almost empty. That emptiness is deceptive, but it is also poetic. The contrast between the wooden shell and the hidden occupants gives the story its eerie calm. One can imagine the night air around it, the rough grain of the timber, the finality of abandonment, the silence that gathers before the city chooses its fate. In many ways, Odysseus belongs to that silence. He is not only a man of action, he is a man who can wait while others move too soon. He can endure uncertainty long enough for a plan to work. The horse reflects that endurance. It is a victory that depends on remaining unnoticed. This is not the loud glory of direct combat. It is a different kind of heroism, one tied to foresight, restraint, and an almost unsettling patience. Ancient audiences may have admired it, but they also seem to have recognized its cost. A mind that can conceal such a plan is a mind that must live with concealment. Seen in that light, the Trojan horse is not merely one famous episode among many. It becomes a concentrated image of the Odyssean world itself. Everything about it is layered. It is a gift that is not a gift, a retreat that is not a retreat, and a victory that immediately leads into another kind of hardship. That complexity is part of why Odysseus remains such an enduring figure. He is never just the hero who wins. He is the hero whose wins are complicated, whose intelligence cannot be separated from consequence, and whose success always seems to open a new path into uncertainty. And so the horse lingers in memory not only because it is clever, but because it feels strangely human. It contains hope, risk, calculation, and exhaustion all at once. It shows how much can be achieved through patience and how fragile trust can be in the wrong moment. In the long story of Odysseus, it stands as one of the clearest signs of his mind at work, yet it also signals that the real journey has only just begun. Odysseus is often remembered as the man who could outthink monsters, but one of the quieter parts of his story is how often he survives by becoming almost unrecognizable. Again and again, he does not win by standing apart and shining as a hero in full armor. He wins by folding himself into the world around him, by listening first, by waiting, by taking in the shape of a place before acting. That quality is easy to overlook because epic poetry loves grand entrances and dramatic speeches, yet Odysseus is just as defined by restraint as by cleverness. He can endure silence in a cave, dirt on his hands, salt on his skin, and the long discomfort of not being in control. In a poem shaped by storms and shouting, this is a remarkable kind of intelligence. It suggests a mind trained not only for strategy, but for patience, for reading people, for understanding that survival sometimes depends on seeming smaller than you are. Ancient audiences may have admired this as a form of practical wisdom, a very Greek ideal in its own way, where excellence is not merely physical brilliance but the ability to adapt. In that sense, Odysseus feels almost like a figure of thresholds, always standing between identities, never fully fixed in one shape for long. He is warrior and wanderer, king and beggar, guest and intruder, a man who seems to understand that the world is full of doors that only open for someone willing to arrive quietly. That shifting nature becomes especially striking when we think about his name, because even the name Odysseus has a kind of unsettled feeling to it. Scholars have long wondered about its deeper origin, and like so much in Homeric study, there is no single certainty everyone agrees on. The name appears to be connected in ancient tradition with ideas of pain, wrath, or being the object of hostility, though the exact linguistic pathway remains debated. Some ancient explanations try to make the name fit his character by linking it to suffering, as though Odysseus were the man hated or the one who causes anger. And that kind of folk etymology tells us something important about how later listeners imagined him. His life is full of friction, full of relationships strained by testing and trickery, full of wounds both physical and social. Even before the famous journey home, there is a sense that this is not a man who moves easily through the world. He is brilliant, yes, but brilliance in the epic often attracts attention from gods and rivals alike. His name seems to carry a kind of hard texture, as if language itself recognizes that his path will be rough, and yet that roughness is part of his allure. He is not a smooth hero. He is a hero whose life leaves marks, and whose identity is always being interpreted by others, just as we are still interpreting it now. Another detail that makes Odysseus feel especially human is how deeply his story is tied to the social world of hospitality, the ancient practice known as xenia. In the Homeric world, hospitality is not merely politeness, it is sacred structure, a moral law, a way of recognizing that strangers may be protected by the gods. Odysseus moves through a landscape where meals, gifts, bedchambers, and questions about one's name all matter intensely. A good host offers shelter before asking too much. A good guest does not abuse what is given. Odysseus knows this system intimately, and much of the poem turns on whether it is honored or broken. He is welcomed by some and devoured almost literally by others who reject the guest-host bond. The Cyclops scene is so disturbing precisely because it reverses everything civilized life is supposed to mean. There is no ritual, no shared wine, no blessing of Zeus as protector of guests. In contrast, the courts of kings like Alcinous feel almost luminous with order, where food is placed before questions, and music drifts softly through the hall before the stranger is pressed to speak. Odysseus is a master of this system because he understands its fragility. He can use it, but he is also shaped by it, moving through a world in which every threshold carries ethical weight. For a sleepy mind, it is oddly soothing to imagine him passing from house to house under lamps and braziers, tasting the discipline of a civilization that believes the stranger must be both questioned and protected. And then there is the famous matter of his disguises, which are not just practical tricks but deeply symbolic acts. Odysseus does not simply wear another appearance, he inhabits the uncertainty of being unseen. When he returns to Ithaca, he does not burst through the door as king in triumph. He comes back as an old beggar, weathered and unremarkable, carrying the burden of hidden knowledge. This is one of the most haunting images in the entire epic. The man who once commanded ships and spoke before armies now stands at the edge of his own house, barely noticed. The disguise allows him to test loyalties, to observe how his world has changed, and to learn who remains faithful in his absence. But it also creates a strange emotional tension because the audience knows what others do not. Odysseus is present and absent at once. He sees everything, but cannot yet claim anything. There is something almost devotional in the patience of that moment, as if identity itself must pass through a quiet chamber before it can be restored. In the hands of later poets and artists, this image of the disguised hero became a favorite because it captures a deeper truth. Recognition is never simple. People are often most themselves when hidden, and most vulnerable when unrecognized. Odysseus understands this, and the poem lets us sit with the long, gentle ache of that concealment before revelation arrives. His relationship with speech is just as important as his relationship with disguise. Odysseus is famously persuasive, but his eloquence is not the loud, theatrical kind that fills a room indiscriminately. It is calibrated. He knows how to tell a story, how to delay a truth, how to reveal just enough. In the epic, he often speaks in layered ways, meaning one thing to the listener before him and another to the wider audience. This double-minded quality is part of what makes him so fascinating. Speech for Odysseus is an instrument of navigation. It helps him move through danger, appease authority, test the openness of strangers, and shape how he will be remembered. Even his long-embedded tale to the Phaeacians, where he recounts his wanderings, feels like a performance of memory under moonlight, each episode carefully selected and arranged. There is warmth in the way he becomes storyteller of his own suffering, turning experience into pattern. At the same time, the poem seems aware that language can also conceal. Odysseus is not always fully transparent, and this is not presented as a flaw alone. It is part of his survival intelligence. He lives in a world where blunt honesty can be dangerous, and where words like oars or nets can be tools for crossing deep water. The result is a hero whose mind is as active as any battlefield, and whose most powerful weapon may be his ability to shape attention itself. The journey home also reveals something tender about his attachment to place. Odysseus is a wanderer, but he is not at ease in wandering. The sea may be his testing ground, yet Ithaca remains the dim, persistent center of his longing. It is often described as small and rocky, less splendid than other realms in the poem, and perhaps that very modesty is what makes it so meaningful. Odysseus does not yearn for an empire of marble and gold. He yearns for a home with familiar slopes, a bed rooted in the earth, a household with its own particular smell and shape. The ancient poet gives us a striking image through the famous bed he built around a living olive tree, a bed that cannot be moved because it is fused into the home's foundations. That image is deeply domestic and strangely sacred. It ties marriage, memory, and landscape together in a single object. Scholars have long admired how this detail turns home into something more than a place of residence. It becomes a structure of identity, a center that can anchor a life against the drift of time. For Odysseus, returning home is not merely about reclaiming property or political authority, it is about recovering continuity. After years of fragmentation, after strange shores and drifting nights, he wants the old shape of the world back again. In that longing, many listeners across centuries have recognized something gentle and universal. His bond with Penelope is one of the most remarkable parts of the epic, partly because it is built not on constant reunion, but on absence, testing, and shared intelligence. Penelope is often read as Odysseus's equal in cunning, and that comparison is more than flattering. She too operates through delay, interpretation, and careful management of appearances. Her famous weaving and unweaving of layets, shroud, is not just a clever trick to postpone remarriage. It is a domestic strategy that echoes, in a quieter register, the same kind of flexible thinking Odysseus uses at sea. Their marriage becomes a dialogue between minds that understand uncertainty. When he finally reveals himself, the recognition does not happen quickly or carelessly. It is staged through signs, memory, and private knowledge, especially the secret of the bed. That delay is emotionally exact. A true return after such a long absence cannot be instantaneous. Trust must be rebuilt in layers. The poem is unusually attentive to this, allowing the couple's reunion to feel earned rather than merely celebrated. There is a soft, almost luminous patience in the scene, as if the household itself is holding its breath. In many ways, Penelope's endurance mirrors Odysseus's own, and their story suggests that constancy can be active rather than passive. It can involve intelligence, caution, and the quiet strength to withhold certainty until it is safe to give it. As the story moves toward its final violence, Odysseus becomes more difficult to read, because the returning king is also a man carrying accumulated anger. This part of the epic is often discussed for its brutality, especially the slaughter of the suitors and the servants who have been disloyal. To modern readers, the scale of retribution can feel severe, even unsettling. But within the logic of the poem, this is framed as the restoration of a violated order. The suitors have not simply courted Penelope, they have consumed the household, violated hospitality, and treated the home as if it were already theirs. Odysseus's response is both personal and political. He reasserts rightful kingship through force, but the emotional atmosphere is thick with something older than law, the hard pulse of honor, shame, and recompense. Ancient audiences would have recognized the seriousness of that imbalance. Still, the episode leaves room for reflection, because Odysseus is not a purely polished avenger. He is a man whose long suffering has compacted into decisive violence. The poem does not ask us to find this easy. Instead, it presents a world where order is repaired through blood, and where the returning hero must carry the moral weight of that restoration. Even here, though, his actions are not impulsive. They are measured, planned, and linked to the knowledge he has been gathering all along. The stillness before the burst of action gives the scene its chilling force. And yet, after so much intensity, what lingers most about Odysseus may be his endurance rather than his triumphs. He is a figure of staying power, someone who can move through humiliation, loss, temptation, and fatigue without being erased by them. That is perhaps why his story has remained so alive for so many centuries. Different eras have seen different Odysseus's in him: the crafty ruler, the restless explorer, the survivor of trauma, the exemplary husband, the questionable manipulator, the adventurous seeker, the man trying to get back to a life that no longer waits unchanged. His richness comes partly from this openness. The poem does not reduce him to a single virtue, it gives him a complicated moral weather. He can be compassionate and ruthless, faithful and deceptive, humble and proud. In that complexity, he resembles real human experience more closely than many cleaner heroes do. He is not a symbol sitting still in the light. He is a person moving through rain, salt, dark water and fire, trying to remain himself. Perhaps that is why his journey feels less like a straight road than a slow turning of seasons. We watch him lose, wait, disguise, return and remember, and in the end, his greatest victory may be not conquest but continuity, the fragile and precious act of coming back to the place that still knows his name. One of the most famous episodes in Odysseus's wandering involves the Cyclops Polyphemus, a giant one-eyed figure who lives apart from civilized society. The encounter is frightening, but it also reveals several of Odysseus's defining traits. He is curious, cautious in some moments and reckless in others, and above all able to think under pressure. When trapped in the cave, he cannot simply overpower his enemy. Instead, he uses deception, planning, and timing to escape. In the long tradition of Greek storytelling, this is the kind of scene that audiences would have remembered easily. A dark cave, a monstrous opponent, and a hero who survives not by strength alone, but by quick intelligence. The story feels compact, almost like a self-contained tale told by firelight, yet it also opens onto larger themes that run through the whole Odyssey. Odysseus is always navigating limits. Sometimes those limits are physical, as when he is shut inside a cave. Sometimes they are social, as when he must decide how to speak to strangers. And sometimes they are moral, as when survival pulls him toward choices that are clever but not fully wise. The Cyclops episode gathers all of that into one memorable encounter. The scene with the Cyclops has a harsh, cave-like atmosphere that feels almost primal. There is little of palace culture here, little of law or polite exchange. The Cyclops world is one of isolation and brute force, which makes Odysseus's intelligence look even more necessary. He calls himself nobody as part of the escape plan, turning language itself into a tool of survival. That moment has fascinated readers for centuries because it shows how identity can be bent temporarily in order to endure danger. In many ways, the name trick is one of the most famous examples of verbal cunning in all of ancient literature. It works because it takes advantage of a simple but profound ambiguity. A word can be both a label and a sentence. When Polyphemus cries out that nobody is hurting him, the other Cyclopes think the complaint is empty, and so they do not come. The scene is funny in a bleak, tense way, and that contrast is part of its enduring power. It reminds us that language in the Odyssey is never just decoration. It can wound, conceal, mislead, and rescue. In a world where direct force fails, speech becomes a kind of invisible weapon. But the episode is not just about cleverness. It also shows that Odysseus's own pride can make things worse. After he escapes, he reveals his true name, and that boastful act gives Polyphemus the power to curse him. Many readers and scholars have seen this as one of the poem's deepest lessons. Odysseus knows how to conceal himself, but he does not always know when to remain silent. The hero who survives by wit can still be undone by vanity. This is one of the reasons the Cyclops episode feels so psychologically real, even though it belongs to myth. People often make the right decision at the hardest moment, and then spoil it later when the danger seems to have passed. A burst of relief can lead to a burst of pride. In the poem, that pride has consequences that are not immediate but lasting. The curse does not produce a dramatic instant punishment. Instead, it helps set the tone for the long delay ahead. In that sense, the episode becomes a quiet warning. Victory is not complete until the victor has also mastered himself. This balance between self-control and self-display appears often in his story. He is not a flawless model of prudence. He is human and therefore mixed. That complexity keeps him from becoming a flat symbol. He can be wise in one moment and imprudent in the next, just as real people can. Myth gives us a hero who must learn the cost of speech as much as the power of it. The Odysseus of the poem is never quite a simple type. He is not merely the cunning man, nor merely the suffering husband, nor merely the restless adventurer. He is all of these at once, and the Cyclops episode captures that layered nature especially well. Scholars have long noted that Homeric heroes are often tested not only in battle, but in self-presentation, in the management of reputation, and in the tension between private identity and public fame. Odysseus wants to survive, but he also wants to be recognized. Those two desires can sit beside each other peacefully for a while, and then suddenly collide. The result is one of the most memorable moments in the epic, because it feels both heroic and very human. Polyphemus himself is also interesting as a figure of contrast. He lives outside communal order, lacks the hospitality expected in Greek culture, and represents a kind of uncivilized space that epic storytelling treats with caution. Odysseus's confrontation with him becomes a test not only of survival, but of what civilization claims to be. The hero's escape is therefore more than personal victory. It is a return of order from the edge of wildness. In the ancient Greek world, hospitality was not a minor courtesy. It was a deeply important social principle tied to divine favor and to the bonds between strangers. A host was expected to welcome, feed, and protect the guest before asking questions. Polyphemus reverses that expectation completely. He is not merely rude, he is a kind of anti-host, a creature who devours instead of shelters. That reversal makes the scene feel morally stark. Odysseus enters a place where the rules that usually hold society together no longer function. His response is to improvise rules of his own. He cannot rely on the protections of custom, so he must create a temporary order through strategy. The cave becomes a place where culture and unculture meet, and the hero's mind has to work in the gap between them. The details of the blinding scene are vivid in the poem, but they also have a ritual quality. Fire, sharpened wood, screams, and darkness turn the cave into a place of transformation. Odysseus and his men are not the same afterward. They have crossed a threshold of violence that cannot be forgotten. In many ways, that is true of all the major encounters on the journey. Each one leaves a residue. The Odyssey does not treat suffering as something quickly erased once an obstacle is overcome. Instead, it lingers. Even a successful escape carries memory with it. The men who drive the stake into the Cyclops' eye enter a situation that is both practical and symbolic. They are fighting for their lives, but they are also marking a break between sight and blindness, knowledge and ignorance, human craft and raw appetite. Some readers have interpreted the scene as a kind of dark inversion of ancient ritual practices, where heat, pain, and transformation are linked. Others are more cautious, seeing simply the epic's taste for intense physical imagery. Either way, the effect is unmistakable. The cave is no longer just a location. It becomes an ordeal space, a place where identity is tested under pressure, and where escape feels almost like rebirth. It is worth noticing that this episode has lasted so long in cultural memory because it feels like a complete miniature of the whole Odyssey. There is danger, disguise, intelligence, pride, and divine consequence. There is also a strange mixture of triumph and regret. Odysseus wins his freedom, but he also invites a future burden through his own need to be known. That mixture is one of the poem's most distinctive qualities. Pure victory is rare in Homer. Even the best outcomes arrive with shadows attached. This is why the Cyclops story continues to speak to readers across time. It is not simply a monster tale. It is a story about the costs of cleverness, the risks of speech, and the uncertain line between successful survival and unnecessary exposure. In oral tradition, episodes like this would have had great staying power because they are easy to retell and rich in meaning. A listener could remember the sequence of events quickly, but the implications would continue to unfold afterward. That is one reason the story feels so alive. It is both immediate and reflective, both exciting and quietly instructive. And so the Cyclops story remains one of the clearest windows into his character. It tells us that he can outthink the impossible, but it also reminds us that wisdom must sometimes include restraint, silence, and a willingness to let victory remain unannounced. There is something almost meditative in that lesson. Odysseus's greatest strength is not simply intelligence in the abstract, but the ability to adapt to changing conditions. Yet adaptation alone is not enough. The poem suggests that true wisdom also requires knowing when not to speak, when not to reveal, and when to let a moment pass without claiming it too loudly. This is part of what makes Odysseus so enduring as a literary figure. He is not perfect, and the poem does not pretend that he is. Instead, it lets us watch a mind at work, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes carelessly, always under the weight of consequence. The Cyclops episode gives that mind one of its most dramatic tests, and it remains compelling because it captures a truth that feels timeless. Cleverness can open a door, but only restraint can help someone walk through it safely. Another reason the episode stays vivid is the way it moves between scale and intimacy. On one hand, it is grand mythic storytelling, involving a monstrous being tied to the larger world of gods and heroes. On the other hand, the key actions are surprisingly small and practical. A stake must be sharpened, wine must be given, the monster must be made sleepy. The escape depends on details that could almost belong to a folktale, which gives the whole scene a grounded feel. Ancient audiences may have heard echoes of older wandering tales in it, stories in which a traveller outwits a dangerous giant or forest dweller by using wit and patience. Homer's version absorbs that kind of folklore energy and folds it into an epic setting. The result is both old and fresh. The tale feels ancient in the way dreams feel ancient, even when we cannot name their source. At the same time, it is precise enough to seem real. The cave's smell, the press of the trapped men, the shock of the blinding, the noise of the fleeing sheep, all of it makes the moment tactile. That sensory quality is part of why the episode works so well for memory and retelling. The relationship between Odysseus and Polyphemus also invites a deeper look at scale in heroic storytelling. Polyphemus is physically enormous, but he is socially small. He has power without community, size without balance, force without hospitality. Odysseus, by contrast, is smaller in body but larger in social intelligence. He understands the systems that make human life possible: naming, exchange, hospitality, planning, and collective action. When those systems fail, he is forced to improvise, but the values behind them still shape his choices. Even in the cave, he is thinking in terms of a social world from which the Cyclops has detached himself. This is one reason the episode can be read as more than an adventure. It becomes a meditation on what it means to live inside a civilized order and what happens when that order is absent. The monstrous is not just the unfamiliar, it is also the refusal of shared norms. Odysseus survives by bringing a measure of order into disorder, even if only temporarily. At the same time, the poem does not let us forget the cost of that survival. The men are terrified. Their situation is desperate. Their cleverness comes only after suffering. This emotional weight matters. It keeps the episode from feeling like a simple puzzle solved by a brilliant mind. There is fear here, and exhaustion, and a kind of grim concentration. Those qualities make the victory feel earned but not joyful in a carefree way. In some readings, the escape from the cave also foreshadows the larger shape of the poem itself. Odysseus is constantly moving from enclosure to release, from threat to temporary safety, only to find that new dangers wait farther on. His life becomes a sequence of narrow exits. The Cyclops cave is one of the earliest and clearest examples of that pattern. It teaches the audience how to read the rest of the journey, not as a straight line toward home, but as a chain of partial recoveries under pressure. Seen in that light, the famous nobody trick becomes more than a clever joke. It is a concentrated expression of the poem's larger logic. Identity in the Odyssey is powerful, but it is also fragile. A name can protect and it can expose. A voice can save and it can condemn. Odysseus learns this over and over, though not always gently. The Cyclops episode, with all its force and darkness, shows the danger of becoming too attached to one's own renown. It also shows the brilliance of a mind that can turn a moment of vulnerability into an opening. That dual lesson is why the episode continues to be studied, retold, and remembered. It is dramatic enough to hold attention, but reflective enough to reward slow thought. In the quiet of the larger poem, it stands like a carved image, severe, memorable, and full of meaning that keeps unfolding the more one looks at it. What makes the scene especially enduring is that it does not resolve into a simple moral. Odysseus is both admirable and flawed. Polyphemus is both monstrous and, in some versions of the tradition surrounding him, strangely pitiable as a being cut off from the human world. The episode does not ask us to choose a single feeling and hold it forever. Instead, it lets different truths sit close together. That is one of the quiet strengths of Homeric storytelling. It gives us space to notice contradiction without rushing to erase it. In that sense, the Cyclops story remains a kind of miniature education in how to read the Odyssey itself. We are asked to admire cunning, but also to notice its limits. We are asked to enjoy survival, but also to remember the cost of pride. And we are asked to see that wisdom in this poem is never just about winning. It is about learning how to move through danger with as little needless self-destruction as possible. Another famous stop on Odysseus's journey is the island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. In the world of ancient storytelling, this is one of those episodes that feels almost like a closed room within the open sea, a place where the weather itself can be gathered, sorted, and held in careful order. Aeolus is not simply a magician in the modern sense. He belongs to a mythic landscape where natural forces can be treated as living powers, and where a ruler may be imagined as having practical authority over the invisible things that move ships and storms. The episode has a strangely delicate feeling, as if the world itself can be folded and tied shut for a moment. Aeolus gives Odysseus a bag containing the winds, leaving only the favourable breeze free to carry the ship home. It is one of those gifts in myth that seems almost too perfect, almost too close to success. The sea route opens, the destination appears near, and yet human weakness enters quietly at the wrong moment. There is a kind of pale suspense in that arrangement, because the solution is already in hand, but not yet safely understood. For a sleeping video retelling, it is a soothing kind of almost success, with the softness of a promise that has not quite finished becoming real. Odysseus's crew, believing the bag contains treasure, opens it while their leader sleeps. The winds escape and the ships are blown back out to sea. The scene has a gentle tragedy to it. It is not malicious betrayal. It is confusion, suspicion, and failed trust. In some versions of the tale, the men are exhausted and curious. In others, they are driven by the ordinary human urge to know what has been kept hidden from them. That small impulse, so recognizable and so familiar, becomes disastrous because the stakes are enormous. The ships are almost home when the careful boundary is broken. Ancient audiences may have heard in this a moral about restraint, obedience, and the danger of acting before understanding. But the story also holds something quieter, the fragility of shared purpose. Odysseus cannot sail alone, yet he also cannot fully guard what others choose to do when he is asleep. In the calmest retellings, it feels like a lesson in how close people can come to success and still lose it through misunderstanding. Odysseus himself is burdened by the fact that leadership requires not only wisdom, but the ability to maintain trust among others, and trust is one of the hardest things to preserve at sea, where fear and fatigue can make every sealed thing feel suspicious. The episode also reflects one of the Odyssey's deeper patterns. Help arrives, but it is fragile. Favorable conditions are possible, yet they are easily undone. The poem often seems to arrange moments of almost perfect relief, only to let them dissolve at the edge of perception. That is part of its emotional shape. Odysseus's life becomes a study in almosts, almost home, almost safe, almost free. That repeated near success gives the poem its soft ache. Listeners can feel the narrowing of the path, then the sudden widening again as things slip away. There is something deeply human in that pattern, because many journeys in life are not defined by one great triumph or one great failure, but by the accumulation of near arrivals. The Odyssey turns this into a long, tidal rhythm. A wind is granted, a path is opened, a shore is nearly reached, and then the world shifts. The effect is not only dramatic but strangely meditative, as if the poem is teaching patience by returning again and again to the same tender disappointment. When Odysseus reaches the land of the Laestrygonians, he encounters another severe test. These giant cannibal people destroy most of his fleet, and the story becomes one of the darkest in the journey. Ancient tradition does not always agree on exactly how monstrous they were meant to be taken, and scholarly readers sometimes treat them as part historical echo, part folktale exaggeration, part symbolic image of the unknown dangers of foreign coasts. What matters in the story is the feeling of entering a harbour that looks protective and turns lethal. In maritime life, a harbour usually suggests rest, water, shelter, and the end of strain. Here it becomes the opposite. The ships move inward, and the safe space closes around them. That reversal gives the episode its terrible stillness. There is a moment when the men may think they are near relief, only for violence to erupt from the landscape itself. Here again, the hero's intelligence cannot fully protect everyone. The sea voyage is never under complete control. Ships are vulnerable. Companions are mortal. Entire futures can vanish in a single terrible harbour. The Laestrygonian episode also broadens the sense of scale in the poem. Earlier dangers are often clever, seductive, or enchanted in some way. This one is blunt and overwhelming. It is the destruction of a travelling community. The ships are not just damaged, but shattered as a way of life. What had been a fleet, a shared enterprise, a moving little society, is suddenly reduced to wreckage. The cruelty of the scene is heightened by its speed. The men do not have long enough to argue, organize, or escape in orderly fashion. Ancient epic often measures catastrophe by the speed with which a whole human structure can fall apart. Here, the speed is almost brutal in its simplicity. The harbour becomes a trap, the inhabitants become predators, and the sea, which so often appears merely difficult, becomes an accomplice to loss. The destruction of the fleet is important because it reduces Odysseus's world. He begins the homeward journey with many men, but he loses them one by one. By the time he is truly alone for much of the later voyage, the emotional tone has changed. The story is no longer about a company returning together. It is about a single survivor carrying memory forward. That change is easy to miss if one only follows the outer plot, but it is central to the poem's emotional life. Odysseus is not simply someone who endures. He becomes a vessel for remembering those who do not. Each death, each ship lost, each unseen body left behind on a foreign shore is part of the burden that makes his eventual homecoming feel more solemn than triumphant. The path home is never just a route. It is also a thinning of the world. The silence that grows around him is not empty. It is full of absences. That loneliness deepens the meaning of every decision he makes afterward. The sea has taken his friends, and he must continue with the knowledge that some losses cannot be repaired. Ancient epics rarely hide this truth. They keep it close to the surface, where each setback feels both physical and emotional. The poems are careful about such things. They know that a broken mast is not only an object broken, but a set of hopes broken with it. They know that when a ship is lost, a homegoing becomes narrower in the mind. In Odysseus's case, the suffering is not presented with noisy complaint. It gathers more quietly, like damp air in a closed room. The reader or listener is invited to sit with the discomfort of unfinished grief, the kind that cannot be solved by speech alone. That is one reason the Odyssey remains so enduring. It understands that endurance is not the same as victory, and that survival itself can be a sorrowful art. So Aeolus and the Laestrygonians together show two sides of the same slow lesson. Gift and danger can arrive together. Success can collapse suddenly. Leadership is precious but precarious. And Odysseus, for all his wisdom, must still move within a world that can undo plans with one careless act or one disastrous landing. The pairing is effective because it creates a kind of downward pressure in the narrative. The first episode offers possibility wrapped in uncertainty. The second strips away security with frightening speed. One gives the illusion that the homeward road can be managed. The other shows how easily that illusion can be broken. Taken together, they make the voyage feel both vast and intimate. Vast because the sea is larger than any human plan. Intimate because the decisive moments come from trust, doubt, and the small decisions made among tired companions. These stories keep the poem hushed with tension, not from loud spectacle alone, but from the feeling that the sea is always listening. It gives and it takes away, and the traveller can only keep steering onward. The sound of these episodes in a slow retelling is almost like wind moving around the edges of a tent, never fully still, never fully alarming, always present. Odysseus moves through a world where help is real but cannot be possessed, and danger is real even when the surface appears calm. That balance gives the poem its steady, dreamlike ache. It is not a story of simple luck, and not even a story of pure skill. It is a story about navigating the space between them, where human beings do their best with what they are given, and then continue after the giving is undone. What makes these passages linger in the imagination is their quiet attention to limitation. Aeolus can offer a wind, but not guarantee obedience. Odysseus can carry wisdom, but not control every reaction of his men. A harbour can look restful, yet conceal ruin. The poem does not present these truths with harshness. Instead, it lets them settle gradually, like dusk over water. The result is a kind of mournful calm. Even when the events are severe, the telling can remain measured, almost tender. That balance is one of the reasons the Odyssey has lasted so long in cultural memory. It speaks not only to heroic striving, but to the ordinary vulnerability that underlies all travel. Every journey, the poem seems to say, depends on conditions beyond full human command. The sailor can only watch the sky, trust the crew, and keep moving when possible. And so the voyage continues, marked by gifts that slip away and dangers that arrive without warning. Odysseus's story in these middle passages grows more inward even as it moves across the sea. The landscapes are larger than before, but the emotional space becomes narrower, shaped by loss, caution, and the burden of having survived what others did not. There is a hush in that progression, a kind of deepening stillness. The audience is invited not to rush ahead, but to feel the slow pressure of each setback and the fragile hope that still remains beneath it. Circe is one of the most memorable figures Odysseus meets on his journey, partly because she belongs to that ancient zone where hospitality and peril sit almost on top of one another. In the Odyssey, she lives in a house on the island of Aea, and the setting is described with the unsettling calm of a place that looks orderly from the outside while hiding something deeply unnatural within. Her home is domestic in form, yet filled with enchantment. There are doors, rooms, tools, and a place where food might be prepared, but the atmosphere is not comforting. Instead, it feels suspended, as if the island itself has learned how to wait. When Odysseus's men arrive there, Circe receives them as a host might, only to transform some of them into pigs. The scene is frightening precisely because it is not a battlefield. It is a house scene. Ancient myth often places the most disturbing changes in locations that should offer rest, and Circe's dwelling becomes one of the clearest examples of that pattern. The everyday and the impossible are pressed together so closely that the difference between welcome and danger becomes hard to feel. Odysseus is protected in this encounter by a divine herb given to him by Hermes, and that detail gives the episode its particular shape. He is not stronger than Circe in any simple physical sense, and the story does not present him as someone who can overcome every threat by willpower alone. Instead, he has help, and the help arrives from a god. Hermes gives him the plant called moly, a strange protective gift that allows him to resist Circe's magic. In the poem, the herb is described with a kind of vivid specificity that makes it feel both real and mysterious. It has a dark root and a white flower, and the image carries a faintly botanical, almost medicinal quality, as though the epic is briefly leaning into the language of folk remedy. This is one of the many ways the Odyssey reminds us that Odysseus is clever, but not self-sufficient. He depends on timely assistance, on divine guidance, and on the unstable favor of the gods. His intelligence matters, yet it operates within a world that remains larger than human planning. The hero survives not by isolating himself from the supernatural, but by learning how to move through it carefully. After the initial confrontation, Circe becomes not merely an enemy but a guide, and that shift is one of the Odyssey's most intriguing surprises. She reverses the effect of her spell, restores the men, and then offers Odysseus directions for the road ahead. The transformation in her role is so abrupt that it can feel almost dreamlike. One moment she is a threat, and the next she is a source of knowledge and practical guidance. This sort of reversal appears often in myth, where a figure who seems hostile at first may turn into a helper once the proper relationship is established. In Circe's case, the change also has a distinctly feminine and domestic texture. She is associated with weaving, with household space, with the management of a private island home, and yet she is also connected to powers that lie far beyond ordinary domestic life. She teaches, instructs, and reveals what must be done next. In that sense, she is both enchantress and counselor. Her presence suggests that danger and wisdom are not always separate in mythic storytelling. Sometimes they arrive from the same doorway. One of the most haunting parts of the Circe sequence is the suggestion that Odysseus stays with her for a significant period. The epic does not hurry through this delay. Instead, it allows time to become soft around the edges, as if the journey itself has entered a kind of sleep. This is one of the most human parts of the poem, because it understands how easy it can be to pause too long in a place that asks nothing urgent of you. The island of a year may not feel like home, but it offers comfort, shelter, food, and temporary relief from struggle. That combination can become strangely absorbing. The listener senses that the longer Odysseus remains, the more the path back to Ithaca risks fading into a distant intention rather than an immediate necessity. Ancient audiences would have recognized the moral shape of such a pause. To linger is not always to rest. Sometimes it is to lose momentum, and in epic stories, momentum is often tied to fate itself. Odysseus must eventually leave, and his departure gives the episode its quiet ache. The island becomes a place of temptation not because it is obviously sinful, but because it is restful enough to make forgetting feel possible. Soon afterward comes the descent to the underworld, where Odysseus seeks counsel from the dead, and the tone of the poem changes at once. If the Circe episode feels enchanted and liminal, the underworld feels solemn and near stillness itself. This is one of the oldest and most serious motifs in Greek myth, the living man traveling into the land of shades to ask questions that cannot be answered anywhere else. In some traditions, such journeys are called nekyia, and they are less about adventure than about contact with memory, death, and hidden knowledge. Odysseus does not go below simply to witness marvels. He goes because he needs information, but the price of that information is emotional and spiritual weight. The dead speak with a gravity that cuts through the epic's usual motion. Their words remind him, and us, that life is brief, that return is uncertain, and that the path home is shadowed by losses that cannot be repaired. The underworld is not a place of action in the ordinary sense. It is a place where silence itself seems to listen. The underworld journey also gives the poem a rare stillness, and that stillness is part of its power. There is no bright victory here, no ringing triumph, no scene of combat resolved by force. Instead, Odysseus stands among shades and receives knowledge in a form that is almost painful to bear. He learns from figures he once knew, from heroes, from mothers, from the dead who can no longer participate in the world except through speech. This is a profound deepening of the poem's emotional landscape. Odysseus is not only the man who outwits monsters or endures storms, he is also the man who must listen to mortality speaking back to him. The encounter broadens the meaning of his voyage. Return to Ithaca is not simply a matter of crossing water and surviving enemies. It also involves confronting the fate of every human being, including the possibility that home itself will never be fully restored to what it once was. The underworld passage asks the listener to hold together two truths at once, that the journey continues and that all journeys are eventually measured against death. In many ways, Circe and the underworld belong together, even though they belong to different realms of the mythic imagination. One offers enchantment, sensuality, and transformation within a domestic space. The other offers truth under dim light, where speech becomes almost ceremonial. One turns bodies into animals, while the other strips away the body altogether, leaving only voices, memories, and faint identity. Yet Odysseus passes through both, and the pairing matters because it reveals the range of his trial. He must deal with the seductive and the solemn, the playful and the grave, the living house and the land of the dead. Both episodes test his endurance in different ways. The house of Circe threatens to dissolve his purpose through comfort, while the underworld threatens to strip away consolation by reminding him of what cannot be escaped. He carries the fragile hope of home through both spaces, and that hope becomes a kind of quiet thread binding the poem together. It is not a loud hope. It does not dominate the scene, but it persists. And so these middle episodes give Odysseus's myth an especially dreamlike quality. The sea, the island, the underworld, the warnings, and the transformations all seem to belong to a world where time itself has loosened its grip. In the Odyssey, this middle stretch can feel less like a straightforward sequence of events and more like a long, half-lit passage through states of uncertainty. The listener moves from one threshold to another. At every turn, someone speaks in riddles, or offers instruction, or reveals that the world is larger and more unstable than it first appeared. This is part of what makes the poem so lasting. It understands that human life is not only made of victories and destinations. It is also made of pauses, detours, forecasts, and moments when one must proceed without knowing exactly what awaits. Odysseus keeps going anyway, and that may be the most heroic thing of all. Not a single dramatic act, but the continued willingness to move forward through foggy knowledge, through fatigue, through enchantment, and through the dim pressure of what lies beneath the surface. There is also something quietly important about how these episodes expand Odysseus as a character. He is often remembered as the master of stratagems, the man who can think his way out of traps, but these scenes show a different dimension of his intelligence. He is receptive, he listens, he accepts help when it comes, whether from Hermes, from Circe after her hostility softens, or from the dead in the underworld. That kind of intelligence is less theatrical than trickery, but perhaps more enduring. It belongs to someone who understands that survival is often collaborative, even in a heroic world. The Odyssey repeatedly places him in situations where control slips away, and the poem never fully lets him regain it by force. Instead, he survives by attention, patience, and a willingness to be taught. For a story about return, that is an especially gentle lesson. Homeward movement is not just about pushing onward. It is also about learning what one can bear, what one must leave behind, and what guidance must be accepted without resistance. The atmosphere of these chapters is one reason they linger so powerfully in memory. Circe's house, with its mix of ease and menace, feels almost like a dream of domestic life displaced into the supernatural. The underworld, with its muted voices and cold wisdom, feels like the underside of memory itself. Together, they create a kind of reflective corridor in the poem, where action slows and meaning deepens. Ancient storytellers often understood that a journey becomes more compelling when it includes places that do not fit cleanly into ordinary categories. Circe is neither fully villain nor fully ally. The underworld is neither mere horror nor mere revelation. Odysseus moves through both, and each encounter leaves him more aware of the cost of continuing. The road home is never only a road. It is a changing field of relationships, obligations, and unseen influences. In that sense, these episodes are not just interruptions in the epic. They are part of its soul, quiet and strange, and always half in shadow. By this point in the long story, Odysseus has become more than a single man in motion. He has become a kind of measure for endurance itself, a figure who keeps moving even when every route seems to close around him. In the later parts of the tradition, that quality matters more than any single cleverness. Ancient listeners would have recognized that survival in epic poetry is not only about strength, but about the ability to remain intact while the world changes shape around you. Odysseus carries that burden quietly. Again and again, he is the one who notices where others rush forward, the one who waits, studies, and chooses the less dramatic path. That patient intelligence is one reason he remains so memorable. It is also one reason his story can feel strangely restful in the telling, because his victories often come not through noise, but through pause, observation, and timing. And yet the later myths also make clear that Odysseus is not simply lucky or endlessly protected. His life is shaped by a deep tension between skill and vulnerability. Even when he succeeds, the success is unstable, provisional, and never fully safe. Ancient storytellers seem to have understood this very well. Heroism in the Greek imagination is often shadowed by fragility, and Odysseus may be the clearest example of that balance. He is wise, but not omniscient. He is favored, but not immune. The sea may let him pass one day and punish him the next. The gods may guide him and mislead him in the same breath. That uncertainty gives the narrative its pulse. It also makes Odysseus feel recognizably human because his cleverness does not erase the possibility of loss. One of the quieter things about his tradition is how often he survives by understanding identity as something changeable. He is not always the king of Ithaca in a simple, fixed sense. Sometimes he is a beggar, a stranger, a castaway, a hidden observer standing at the edge of his own home. This is one of the most distinctive features of his character in literature. He moves through the world wearing different social meanings, and each one reveals a different layer of the self. Modern readers often imagine disguise as a theatrical device, but in the ancient context, it also reflected a world where status, hospitality, and recognition were deeply fragile. To be known was to be safe, and to be unknown was to be exposed. Odysseus lives inside that tension for years, and perhaps that is why his return feels so powerful. He does not merely arrive home. He re-enters the world through the delicate act of being recognized again. That same concern with recognition appears in many of the episodes attached to him outside the main epic. Later traditions love to ask whether Odysseus is truly identifiable by his body, his voice, his scars, or his behavior. One famous sign is the scar on his leg, a physical mark that stands in for the whole hidden history of the man. In a world before documents and portraits, the body itself often served as proof. A scar could function almost like a memory made visible. Odysseus's scar is not simply a dramatic detail. It is a reminder that past violence remains written onto the self. His story is full of such traces. He is a man who returns carrying evidence of everything that happened to him, even when he says very little. The body remembers what the tongue may not wish to repeat. The ancient poets also understood that Odysseus's fame depended on the quality of his speech. He is one of the great talkers of Greek literature, but not in the simple sense of being verbose. His language is adaptive. He can be formal in counsel, pleading in disguise, sharp in argument, or tender in supplication. He knows how to address different audiences because he listens closely to who they are and what they expect. In a culture built on oral performance, that flexibility was a kind of power. Words could welcome, deceive, appease, or challenge. Odysseus uses speech the way a navigator uses the stars, taking direction from circumstances while also shaping the route ahead. His eloquence is therefore never only decorative. It is practical, social, and sometimes life-saving. Even in silence, the possibility of speech seems to hover around him like a tool kept ready in the hand. This is perhaps why so many later writers treated him as the patron figure of ambiguous intelligence. He was not the clean, straightforward hero of a battlefield charge. He belonged to corners, thresholds, and uncertain spaces. The Trojan horse tradition, whether historical memory or poetic invention, fits that image perfectly. It is a story about concealment becoming strategy, about waiting inside darkness until the right moment opens. Ancient audiences would have known that such tactics carry moral complexity. Cleverness can protect, but it can also unsettle. Odysseus stands at that uneasy boundary. He is admired for his mind, yet never entirely simplified into a harmless trickster. The brilliance of his reputation lies in the fact that the same skill that rescues him can also make him difficult to trust. That duality helps explain why his name has remained so enduring across centuries of retelling. There is also a quieter domestic dimension to his legend, especially once the story turns toward Ithaca. The reunion with his home is not presented as an easy return to comfort. It is a restoration process, slow and tense, filled with tests of memory and loyalty. The household itself is almost like a living organism that has been strained over time. The halls are occupied by men who do not belong there. The old order has thinned. The loom, the bed, the bow, and the recognition scenes all become part of a carefully assembled proof that identity can survive long absence. Odysseus's homecoming is therefore not just geographical. It is ritual, emotional, and social. He must reconstruct a world in which the past still matters. That careful reconstruction gives the ending of the tale its strange stillness, as if a disturbed room is being gradually put back into place. And yet, even in return, there is no complete release from wandering. Later traditions do not always allow Odysseus a settled conclusion. Some versions imagine further travel, further conflict, or a final death far from the sea he knew so well. This open-endedness may be one reason the figure remained so adaptable in later literature. A hero whose life continues after the supposed ending can be taken up by new generations without feeling closed off. Odysseus becomes a kind of vessel for continuation. He is the man who cannot quite stop moving, even when he has reached the shore. For sleep-time storytelling, there is something soothing in that rhythm of motion and rest, departure and return. It resembles the cycle of waves against a dark coastline, each one arriving and receding without urgency. Scholars have long noted, too, that Odysseus belongs to a mythic world where the gods are not distant abstractions, but active presences shaping the texture of each day. Athene in particular is closely tied to him, and their relationship is marked by recognition, guidance, and mutual affinity. She does not simply rescue him in a direct, simple way. Instead, she supports the qualities that already define him: careful judgment, disguise, and tactical patience. Their alliance suggests that intelligence itself was imagined as something divinely favored, but only when joined to restraint. Odysseus is not the kind of man who dominates his world by force alone. His success comes through an almost conversational relationship with fate, one in which hints, veils, and signs must be read correctly. That ancient vision of intelligence remains compelling because it is so subtle. Wisdom here is not loud, it is attentive. The later tradition also makes space for Odysseus as a moral problem, not only a hero. Some stories praise him for cunning, while others question the cost of his decisions. He can appear merciful in one moment and ruthless in another. He can protect his companions, and he can also be the last survivor of a disaster he did not prevent. This complexity is not a flaw in the tradition, it is part of its depth. Greek epic rarely asks the audience to admire a single purified trait. Instead, it invites reflection on the mixed nature of human action. Odysseus embodies that mixture unusually well. He is the man of many turns, many strategies, many faces. His story encourages the listener to accept that intelligence is never completely separate from danger, and that survival sometimes leaves ethical shadows behind it. Even his name carries that sense of tension. Ancient readers and later scholars have tried to trace the meaning of Odysseus, connecting it to ideas of pain, wrath, hostility, or being hated. No single explanation is universally accepted, and the uncertainty itself is telling. His name sounds as though it belongs to an unsettled world. It is fitting for a hero whose life is marked by conflict with the sea, the gods, and the limits of human control. Names in the ancient world were never merely labels. They could carry memory, expectation, and character all at once. Odysseus's name seems to hold the sound of difficulty within it, as if the story of his life was already audible before the journey began. That kind of linguistic mystery adds another layer to his enduring presence in the tradition. And so, in the closing stretch of his long narrative, Odysseus remains what he has always been, a figure of movement, recognition, and survival under pressure. He is at once deeply specific, tied to Ithaca, to a wife, a son, a home, and a scar, yet also broad enough to symbolize the human condition of trying to find one's way back through uncertainty. Perhaps that is why his story has lasted. It speaks to the experience of being changed by time but still hoping for continuity. It suggests that identity can be hidden, tested, and returned to. It suggests that home is not always a place one simply occupies, but something one must slowly prove oneself worthy of again. In the old poems and in every retelling after them, Odysseus walks that line with quiet persistence, as if the journey itself has become part of his breathing.